The forests, like the Douglas fir forests, live to be hundreds and hundreds of years old. And yet I think what they call the accumulation of mean annual increment, where a tree starts growing rapidly and then it begins to plateau, and so the growth begins to table. And that a lot of times that occurs around 75 or 80 years, even at a relatively young age. That tree becomes mature. And it's a completely different thing from carbon. I think that Bev is pointing out that these trees continue to grow over time in their capacity to store carbon. So, how fast the tree is growing and how much carbon it sequesters are really two different questions.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Christoph, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Now, today's episode was a very cool one. I definitely learned a bunch. I am out of my comfort zone 100% in this one because although forest values and forest management is something that I understand, I have literally no context for it for the United States, and that's all we talked about. So, this was probably the most I've ever prepared for a recording, and also the least prepared I've ever been. But it was good. It was really, really good. Everyone on here gave me a big hand and kind of pulled the conversation along to make sure that what I was asking made sense and that we could get something productive out of this conversation. It was really, really good. A big thank you to everyone involved. So today's episode is all about forest carbon and managing forests for forest carbon solutions. And as such, we needed to provide some context for myself and for other folks around the whole picture of U.S. forests and U.S. forest management. So we brought on a few people. Now, this all started when the Sierra Club reached out to me wanting to talk about managing forests for carbon storage and maybe conserving more mature and old growth forests in the name of carbon sequestration and biodiversity. And so I told them, that sounds awesome, let's do this, but I need more context because I don't know what's going on. So they brought in Dr. Bev Law and Jim Furnish. So before we get to meet Bev and Jim, I want to introduce you to Alex Craven, who was one of the people responsible at Sierra Club for setting this all up. He is a senior campaign representative for Sierra Club. I wanted to say thank you to them again for helping me all out with this. And now, Dr. Bev Law, she is Emeritus Professor of Global Change Biology and Terrestrial Systems Science at Oregon State University. She's done a bunch of research around how the forest actually captures carbon, right? So she made a lot of discoveries around the difference between a forest fire versus forest harvesting and how that carbon is used up in the whole picture. What kind of forests store more, right? Is it young forest because they got lots of growing to do, or is it old forest because they're established and they're big and they're sucking up a lot of resources, right? So we talk a lot about that. And then with all that research context, we brought in Jim Furnish. Now, Jim Furnish was at one point the deputy chief of the Forest Service from 1999 to 2002. He spent 34 years with the Forest Service. He then went on to do a bunch of other stuff. He is an author of Toward a Natural Forest, The Forest Service in Transition, a book that I'm definitely going to check out for sure. He was also, one of his biggest accomplishments that he says is being a big part of creating both the Roadless Area Conservation Rule and the revised National Forest Planning Rule. So he's a really great person to have on here to provide that. What does forest management look like in the States? So it was great to have him on as well. With both of these people and the Sierra Club at the helm, we managed to have a great conversation about managing forests for carbon and kind of maybe some kind of shift that needs to happen in the way we think about forest management. It was a very cool conversation. Really enjoyed it. Thank you to everybody involved. I really had a great time, most especially to Sierra Club for setting this all up. Sponsors. The number one sponsor for Your Forest for 2022 is West Fraser. They've been great. They've allowed me to do this the way I want to do it. And they just give me money and say, do your thing. And you can't have a better partner than that, right? So thank you, West Fraser. It's been great. And Greenlink Forestry is also a major sponsor. Without them, this would not be possible. Been with me since the beginning. Thank you, Greenlink. And Damaged Timber is another. Go to damagedtimber.com, put in your forest 10 at checkout to get 10% off anything you purchase. They put damaged timber in your home. And finally, a new partner is Forest Proud. They are a nonprofit promoting forest climate solutions. They want to keep forests as forests, and I can't thank them enough for their partnership, for their help. It's been really, really cool getting to understand what they get up to and talking to them. So thank you a lot, Forest Proud. And without any further messing around, let's dive into this conversation. Here we go. Awesome. So first of all, thanks a lot, everyone, for coming on. I'm really excited about this. And to get started, like I said, we're going to introduce everybody a little bit. And Alex, I want to get you to start because you, Sierra Club, was the one who kind of initiated this whole thing. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk about your role in Sierra Club and how carbon came onto your plate and what we're here to do today. What kind of do you hope to accomplish today in this conversation?
Sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me. My name is Alex Craven, campaign representative with Sierra Club, focused on forests and based out of the Northwest in Seattle, Washington, Coast Salish and Duwamish territory. I think the piece to highlight up front is Sierra Club's a longtime activist organization focused on conservation of our places. And so over the 125 plus years that the organization's been in existence, there's been moments where we've pivoted and the focus has changed. And I think, mapping out how we've worked for the conservation of wild places, national parks, national forests, and then over time, as the threats of climate change have become more apparent, these aren't just places where we go for restoration or to preserve habitat, though they're still those. It's also places that are performing immense functions in offsetting the worst effects of climate change through carbon storage and sequestration. And nowhere is that more true than mature and old growth forests.
Thanks, Alex. Appreciate that. Bev, do you want to go next? I just kind of want to just give a little bit of a little bit of an introduction of who you are, why you're here specifically, and the conversation that you hope to have here today.
Well, I'm an emeritus professor at Oregon State University, and I have over 30 years of experience doing research on the forest carbon cycle and forest-atmosphere interaction, and then the effects of disturbance and management on forest carbon processes as well as water processes. So I guess I'm interested in this because some of the research we've done is pretty applied, just testing ideas that have been put out there and quantifying the effects, and then hopefully providing some options for where we can go and at least have some science-based decision-making going on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Bev. Appreciate that. And finally, Jim, what's your deal, man? What are you here to talk about today? What do you think?
Well, I'd start with my background with the United States Forest Service. I graduated from forestry school back in 1968 and began my career with the U.S. Forest Service, worked for about 35 years. Went through a fairly traditional career, started most of that as a field forester, got involved in a variety of activities that the Forest Service does, including timber management. I worked my way into planning, land use planning, strategic work, before becoming a district ranger on the Bighorn National Forest in northern Wyoming. Subsequently became a forest supervisor on the Oregon coast in the temperate rainforests. And then eventually, and somewhat unusually, became deputy chief of the organization in 1999. That step from forest supervisor to deputy chief, in my reckoning, has never occurred in the history of the U.S. Forest Service. And so it was somewhat controversial, questionable, a bit troublesome for me. I really wondered if that would work. And when the chief of the Forest Service, Mike Dombeck, asked me to assume the position of the deputy chief, I said, Mike, you're putting you and me and the agency in a tough spot. I'm willing to give it a try, but it's a risky move. But nevertheless, I was there for about 2.5 years before I retired in 2002, and very interested in forest policy issues, and particularly how is the great asset of national forests going to be used by the government and so on in terms of trying to combat climate change.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, and that's why we're here today, right? We're talking about how can we manage forests to help combat climate change? How can we change the way we do things to try to give ourselves some more space, right? Try to help ourselves out as much as possible when it comes to carbon sequestration and that sort of thing. So, and yeah, that's kind of that's the type of stuff that I love, is this whole, how do we make forest management as sustainable as possible, right? How do we include as many values as possible as co-values on the landscape to timber, and not just as something, we try to avoid wrecking kind of thing, right? That's the stuff that I like. And so I'm excited to talk to all of you today about this, right? How do we start to accomplish this? But first, I think I need, being a Canadian in an American conversation, I need context. So Jim, if you want to kind of try and paint a picture for us of the forests and forest management in the United States, how much of it is public versus private, protected, how much of it is managed for timber, how much of it is, however you want to do it. I'm not sure, but try and paint a picture in the listeners' eyes for how they can picture this forest and what we're dealing with.
Well, I'd start out by saying that, when you go to some parts of the world, you see very little in the way of wood as part of construction. You see a lot of stone and concrete and that type of thing. And yet the abundance of forests in the United States has always driven much of the commercial and residential construction. Even before the United States was the United States, there was a lot of active logging beginning back in New England. It swept across the country through the lake states in the south, off into the Rockies, and eventually through the Pacific Northwest and bumped into the Pacific Ocean and had nowhere else to go. Much of that would be characterized as cut and run, or log the crap out of the Forest Service and then leave. This, in large measure, helped spawn the conservation movement, largely through historic figures like John Muir, one of the creators of the Sierra Club, and also Teddy Roosevelt, a very notable figure and a real champion of environmental values. It was thus that the conservation movement was formed in the late 1800s, and they began to look at the vast federal estate, particularly in the western United States, as basically a war chest, if you want to think about that, of creating public lands. The national forests were created late in the late 1800s, and the Forest Service was begun in 1905, followed by the Park Service in 1914. I would characterize the history of the Forest Service in 3 eras. The first era, from its inception until World War II, as a custodial era, where not a great deal happened in the way of land management relative to today. Forest firefighting, obviously, but mostly it was trying to get things like rangeland grazing and horrible logging activities occurring on the public estate under control. And they had some fairly notable success in doing that. World War II changed everything and entered what I call the utilitarian era, where the great estate of national forest, which are about 10% of the whole United States, were put to work on behalf of the American economy. And this is when we started to see the huge logging boom. We entered then, probably I would use the spotted owl crisis in the Pacific Northwest around the early 1990s as a hinge point an era of ecosystem management where the Forest Service has strived, without a great deal of success, I would add, Matt, to achieve this more holistic, multiple value approach of ecosystem management of all the assets of a forest estate, rather than focusing particularly on timber reserves. So those three eras, custodial, utilitarian, ecosystem management, I would say would bring us to the present day. And I'm not entirely sure what the future holds, except I think the discussion we're having today about climate change and the role of forests, public lands in that controversy and debate are on the table and widely discussed. And there are widely varying opinions about what role the national forest should play in that.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Jim. That was really good. Yeah, I kind of needed that. And it doesn't sound, honestly, all that different from Canada in that it was kind of, we showed, colonization happened. People were here and they were kind of like, hey, there's lots of wood. Let's just get it, right? Let's go get it. It's fine. There's tons. And then as time went on, we started getting inventories, started to realize the impact it's having, and you start to maybe dial back a little bit. And now we're at the time where everything's out there and on the table. Everyone knows what's going on in the landscape, and there's no more hiding what's going on, and everything's got to be out front. So it's got to be above board from everybody's perspective, right? And we're so
there are. I might mention there are a couple notable distinctions between Canada and the U.S. The first I've noticed population. And secondly, what is the public forest estate? Because I know that the Crown forests in British Columbia alone exceed the entire U.S. national forest system. So you have a lot more forest and a lot fewer people.
Yes,
that means that exports play a huge role in Canadian forest economic policy. The United States, I think, for a long time was relatively self-sufficient in terms of its wood and forest resources. But I mean, even in my lifetime, I've witnessed the explosion of a global market in wood resources that's really transformed everything. And so the U.S. obviously uses a lot of wood. They import a lot of wood. They export a lot of wood. Very different than Canada.
Yeah. Sure, absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. And I guess that's the context I'm looking for, right? In that forestry in Canada, or at least in my perspective, from the Alberta perspective, is that we're still only harvesting primary forests, right? Like that's still where we're at. There's places where they might be going into, to second pass, but not very many. It's very few and far between, and it's for specific reasons. So we've been lucky. We're very fortunate in Canada that we have so much forest, and we have the opportunity to, our rotation ages are long, right? So our rotation is, it's very long, right? It's not a 50-year rotation or whatever. I don't even know what it is down there, depending on the species, I suppose. But we're talking a standard rotation for conifer is 100 years, right? And even deciduous like aspen would be 80 years still. So whereas it sounds to me like in the States it's a little more obviously with a lot more private and that kind of thing. So can you put a little bit more perspective on public versus private in the States? So how much? And I know I think for me, when I think private forest, I think plantation, and I've realized recently that that's not necessarily the case. So if you can contextualize that, like how much, maybe we'll do it that way. How much plantation versus how much, forest, as I would say, from, a biodiversity standpoint and that kind of thing.
Oh gosh. I will say that my view is that the private industrial forests of the United States, which are actually prodigious. I mean, there's a lot of private industrial national forest, but the bulk of forest in the United States is held by small private landowners. And then you have this whole federal estate of the National Forests, Bureau of Land Management lands, national parks, which are managed very differently. I mean, to try and put it simply, I would say that the private industrial forests are driven largely, although there are some exceptions, by economic pressures. And even those have been changing with some of these, what they call the rights, the RIET, what is it, Alex? I mean, what is that acronym? It's the reinvestment for taxes. I mean, it's really changed a lot of the nature of some of the private industrial holdings from producing timber to just producing income. The public lands have always strived to have more of a environmental footprint, in that they have always espoused things like replanting, sustainable logging. But it was very true that there was a lot of pressure to produce timber for a good 4 decades on the national forest up until about 1992, and then things have softened. But we still see this kind of conundrum we're in with the emergence of forest fires as a huge vector, management vector, climate change, droughts, the loss of old growth and mature forests, carbon sequestration, all these other things like water, wildlife habitat, recreation opportunities. The bind just seems to be getting tighter and tighter.
You said something there that kind of caught my. I wasn't going to ask another one of you just yet. I was going to wait, but you said something about things like replanting. Was reforestation not the norm? Because, like, I mean, at least in Canada, that's a given, right? Like, you're on private land, then you can do what you want with it, right? But there's not a lot of that here, mostly public. And for us, it's like first of all, you can only cut what's being grown. You can't cut more than that, and you have to replant. Like, those are the two foundations of sustainable yield logging, right? So is that not true for the States?
Well, I would say that was definitely not the case, probably up until the 1930s.
I see. Okay.
Very fascinating book called Money Trees that really tracked the emergence of Douglas fir forestry in the Pacific Northwest and the role of private industry, the role of the Society of American Foresters, which was created by Gifford Pinchot, among others, and the emergence of tree farms and the requirements for planting and that kind of thing. But I would say up until then, planting was basically optional. And I think... Sorry, the same is true for Canada. It's not like we've been doing this perfect from the beginning. It's only been the last, 4 decades or so that we've been doing stuff like that. But sorry, even within the role of, replanting forested areas or burnt areas and that kind of thing, there are ways to do it that are really more holistic and environmentally conscientious versus just replanting, particularly for money and economic drivers. And I would say most of what I see on private industrial lands, all the replanting that is legally required is primarily for economic purposes. And I think the Forest Service, among others, has begun planting a lot more with the idea of biodiversity in mind, as opposed to simply planting for money trees. Right.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. Okay. Thanks, Jim. Appreciate that. So I want to jump now. Kind of got a better idea for what's going on.
Sure.
I want to jump now to Bev. I want to start with maybe just getting you to talk about this issue of carbon, and obviously the big study that you've been doing for the last while, and all the media you've been doing around it, kind of what its findings are, measuring the carbon output of forests and that kind of thing. So I kind of want to just leave the floor open to you, Bev, and let you just kind of start, because I'm sure you've done this a million times at this point, and you know the best way to go about it. So I'll just let you tell your story around this study, because it's definitely changed my perspective. And maybe had me thinking a little more cautiously when it comes to, how we do things. So, I'll just let you have the floor.
Sure. A lot of my research has been from site level to whole regions, and from using inventories and satellite data to Earth system modeling. And what we've always been trying to do has been, like I said, I've been doing carbon cycle research for over 30 years, and I was primarily a researcher, and we're looking at trying to figure out what was the role of forests in the carbon cycle, in the global carbon cycle. And then also, how does it respond? How does carbon change in forests with different activities, as well as with climate? And so, I mean, there's a lot that goes into this, but
I know it's a big problem.
It's
How
like,
do you
where
get
do you
it down
start?
Well, I think that's the idea, right? We're trying to understand what is the carbon cycle, because we want to manage forests for the most carbon, as one of the values is carbon, right? We would like to capture carbon as much as possible and store it and keep it to try and fight climate change. And that's one of those things. So we're just trying to put some context onto it.
Sure. And it starts with recognizing that forests take up a lot of carbon from the atmosphere and they release it through their natural processes. And then, so when we look at forest carbon and its value, we're looking at the stocks first. It takes a long time for those stocks to accumulate, just like in a bank account. And so, you want to keep adding to that every year. And that accumulation, and these forests have been, globally, they've been taking up about 31% of the equivalent of our emissions, annual emissions, for the past 60 years. That's a lot.
Yeah.
And the oceans make up a lot of the rest of it. So they've been doing that, but when we get down to the scale of how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and now that we've squandered about 40 years, it's getting really desperate. We need to take some really big actions that we could have taken a long time ago. So what we looked at was, for biodiversity, it's an international agreement amongst a lot of countries that they will try to conserve more land. And how much land did they need to conserve? So at least let's make targets 30% by 2030. And then, of course, there's been a lot of work done that suggests we've already appropriated most of the net primary productivity in the world. We really need to give back some so that we get up to about half Earth, half protected. So when you start looking at, okay, if you do try and work out these targets, where do you do this? How do you prioritize it? So we used satellite inventory and modeling to first map the forest carbon stocks, and then to map biodiversity metrics. In this case, it was species richness, the variety of species that are in those areas. And then we did a comparison. We said, if you were to protect for just carbon, what areas are the highest priority? Those are the forests that have the highest carbon densities. And we did it by ecoregion, because ecoregions are a way it's been tested and verified as a really good way to determine where to conserve nature. So we applied that, it allowed this priority ranking to occur, and it showed us where carbon was highest, and it showed us where species richness was highest. And this is amongst thousands, but it's a lot of species. And what happened was we saw that where we had high carbon density, we also generally had high biodiversity. They go together in the Western U.S. Sure. And globally, people have seen and said the same kind of thing. So we mapped those areas. We first did a study over Oregon as the test region because we had so much data here in Oregon. And then we applied it to the rest of the Western U.S. We also modeled future carbon accumulation under future climate conditions. And so this is the Earth system modeling. It also has a fire model in it, and it has causes and probabilities of fire. And we mapped where forests are the most vulnerable through the year 2050 or 2100. Mm-hmm. So that's where we've gone with it. And we're going, back down to scales of working in other areas now that states have become interested in seeing this and how it might play out. And as when I was actually helped the Forest Service develop the Forest Health Monitoring Program back in the 80s. And we had a lot of indicators. Some of them were structural diversity, soil carbon, a lot of other things like that. And they didn't all get in there. And I always wished that the Forest Service had implemented all of them. Some of them got in there, but not all of them, because we'd be in a lot better shape in deciding or just knowing what we have out there. Satellite data is helping with this a lot now, where if you have high resolution satellite data. So it's this kind of thing where we're data rich in places and data poor in others. And really, to be able to carry out some of these protections, we're going to have to take a closer look. So we pointed out areas like, hey, look here. And then from there, states can go down and bring in more information that they might have that we don't have. And such as endemism, that one's really hard to do without a supercomputer to map that even over the state of Oregon at 30-meter resolution.
Gotcha.
I
wanted to hear about the specifics that you found about the carbon output for young forests versus old forests.
Yeah,
right? So that's something that's kind of something people are always talking about, right?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of confusion about this. So I'll give you two different lines of evidence. And one is that we do these Ameriflex, and Canada does this too. There was a FlexNet Canada. And then we brought it back into the Ameriflex network. I was ahead of the network from North America. We measure carbon dioxide exchange between forests and the atmosphere and other vegetation types. And that gives us the net amount of carbon the whole ecosystem takes up over time. So you can break it out by month or year. And now a lot of our sites have been running 20 years. Well, we saw that amongst sites in Canada and the U.S., after disturbance from fire or harvest, it took 10 to 20 years for the forest to become a net carbon sink again. That means they were a source for that long, 10 to 20 years. Right. So when you look at it from that perspective, 10 to 20 years of putting out more than they're taking in, that's not good. We also measured on a lot of these sites the carbon stocks and the net primary productivity. And then we have inventory data that we used, and we saw how this broke out by age. And of course, the old forests store a lot more, and it varies, but they store a lot more than young forests do. And an example was ponderosa pine. Old growth ponderosa pine stores 20 times the amount of wood that young ponderosa pine stores. So this is a 20-year-old ponderosa pine forest. So, we've done that kind of analysis, and we break it out between young, mature, and old. And you can just see it by the curves when you just plot biomass by age, or you plot annual carbon uptake by age. So the thing is with the stock is something that can stay there for hundreds of years if you just let it. And then you're adding to it annually. And so that's what matters, and it needs to be part of the accounting. The other thing I do is forest carbon accounting.
Right. So 10 to 20 years post-harvest, post-disturbance, I'll say, those young forests are a source, right? And all the old forests continue to be a sink. And so how do we start to compare these two? We're talking about the life cycle of a forest, right? So not really the stand level, but of the forest. So like an old forest, we know at some point something's going to happen to. I mean, maybe not the Pacific Northwest. It's a different kind of story, right? You've got 1,000-year-old ecosystems or 1,000-year-old trees on whatever. You know what I'm saying? Getting word soup here, but how do we start to? I'm trying to find a way to picture this relationship of carbon in the forest, and how do we start to suss out the best way to manage and from my perspective, resource extraction is something that's going to happen. Unless you're going to go Thanos on the world and kill half the population, we need raw material. And it may as well be raw material that is sustainable, right? In some way. And I know there's arguments about how sustainable, but we want to make this as sustainable as possible raw material. So how do we start to understand this concept so that we can start to walk into this and maybe start to do some of this different management? How could people picture this so that it makes sense in their minds? And how do we promote more carbon storage over time?
Okay, so first, not all forests are just solely for logging.
Right.
Okay,
Absolutely.
So when we did our analysis, about 64% of the lands that we identified as being high priority for protection were on federal lands. 25% on private lands, and then
Sure.
less on state and indigenous people's lands. So when we talk about preserving areas, that priority would be on federal lands. And we're not talking about all forests one way or the other, not all forests cutting and not all forests protected. There will be industrial forests. But when we've looked at, and others have looked at, what happens with biodiversity over time in relation to carbon, they don't really start correlating with one another until the stands in Oregon anyway are up about 100 years old.
Okay.
So that gives you an idea of, you should be getting back to the harvest cycles of what you're doing. And when we did an analysis on the PNAS, Proceedings of National Academies of Science, we said, what if you reduce harvest by half of current levels on public lands? And what if you double harvest cycles backed up to 80 years? Now, 80 years, we just chose that because that's the lowest age that you start getting biodiversity coming back. Well, those two strategies contributed the most to being able to increase forest carbon by the year 2100, 2050, and 2100.
Gotcha.
The other ones we looked at were afforestation and reforestation. Afforestation is where you haven't had forest before, and technically in IPCC words, it can't have been a forest for the last 50 years. Reforestation, it was recently forest. And so when we compared those for management approaches, the reduced harvest approach increased forest carbon by 10 times more than reforestation. And then by 2 times higher. So it's 10 times.
Can you say that again? I think I missed that. Say that one more time.
So we ran all those scenarios I was describing, and we compared the reforestation within current forest boundaries. And, wherever we had areas that were current forest boundaries, we reforested. And it still didn't amount to much in terms of carbon accumulation by the year 2050 and 2100. And same in terms of biomass, the total amount of carbon, or the stocks. And it's because it takes the young forest a while to get started, and we call it slow in, fast out. It takes quite a while to get back to where you were. If you harvest a 40-year-old stand, it's going to take 40 years to get back to where you were.
Right. Absolutely.
Hey,
so
Matt.
40-year.
Matt.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jim. Yeah, and I wanted to say this again too. Actually, I didn't say this before we started. Everyone, feel free to cut in if you have something to add. This is not. I don't mean for this to be like me questioning each of you individually. This is like a discussion, conversation, dialogue. So jump on in. Feel free. This is
sure. So, I mean, what Bev is touching on, I'd step back and try to put on my forest manager lens. The reason this is important is one of the philosophical arguments about public forests has always been, why aren't they managed more like private industrial lands?
Oh,
and I mean, this is one of the pressures that national forest managers get is, why don't you manage your lands more like we do, from the private industrial sector? And so Bev is putting her finger on a very crucial thing that relates to values. Yes. If your value is economics, then that's a legitimate question. But if your value really is the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run, and suddenly we have all this overwhelming science about climate change and the role of forests, and particularly the role of old and mature forests in sequestering and holding carbon, is there not an obligation to try and make sure that's an important decision variable? And given the stark contrast between the young forests, which typically are prevalent on private industrial lands, and the remaining older forests that are somewhat abundant in some places, but increasingly precious on public forests, this then becomes a real fulcrum, for decision making. And it's only been in the last 20 years, I would argue, that the issue of climate change and carbon has really landed with a big thump on everybody's desk, said, what are you doing about this? And I would say, as a former Forest Service employee or retiree, I am embarrassed that the U.S. Forest Service has done so little in response to this challenge. They have been absent at the table. And the United States has such an asset with their national forests and with the evidence that Bev has been providing about the crucial role that older, mature forests play in carbon holding and sequestration. And sequestration, I mean, the amount that they pull in every year, it just makes sense that we've got to work out some kind of a new arrangement about the values that the national forests are going to strive to achieve.
Yeah, I would add to that too. Go ahead, Alex. Jim's dead on, and the federal lands, generally speaking, because Bureau of Land Management also has forests with these high value, mature old growth trees area, and even we were hearing, as the time we're recording this, last Friday, President Biden coming out and starting to say that this is an important action, and the United States actually stands to be a position of leadership for the rest of the globe in trying to tackle the biodiversity and climate crises.
Absolutely. It was funny, Jim, when you said this is about values, and everybody, including myself, we were nodding our heads up and down. We were just like, yeah, it is about values. And yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. Like, to me, the carbon capture is one of these quote unquote new values that we're only just realizing. I mean, not just realizing in the context of, the last 20 years kind of thing. That this is something that needs to be managed for. And like you said, Jim, right? The greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? Like, we're talking, even if your only incentive, in my perspective, is economic, is your only incentive economic for you, or for you and your kids and your kids' kids and your kids' kids' kids and your kids' 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 kids? Because if you're talking about economic incentive for the future generations, then you need sustainable forests to keep that industry going. And you only have sustainable forests if the public is on board and you're taking care of their values, as well as the lumber, as well as all the economy, right? And no, I couldn't agree more. I totally agree. I think that timber production can only really, this is my perspective, can only really take place if you're taking care of all those other values as well. And I think that's, at least from the forestry folks that I know in Canada, that's most people's perspective, right? And there may be an argument about where that line is drawn, but no, I couldn't agree more. And it's interesting to me. Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
Well, I was going to say, so in my experience working in the Pacific Northwest during the 1990s, when you had this hyperinflated balloon, the crisis of the northern spotted owls, in logging, and then the federal judge came and stuck a needle in it and blew it up, and everything settled in a completely different direction. We weren't talking about forest carbon at all. Right. I don't remember one mention of forest carbon in the early 1990s. But what we found, and I'm sure that Bev has even been involved in some of these studies, what we found was that the forests of the Pacific Northwest, some of the most abundant carbon stores per acre in the world, were huge emitters of carbon. They were contributing to the problem until the spotted owl crisis stopped the really massive logging of Pacific Northwest forests. And then it went into a long period of kind of quietude where there was still some harvesting going on, but it was vastly reduced from what it had been. And suddenly, the Pacific Northwest forest began accumulating carbon, massive amounts. And so in the period of 25 years, it went from, emitting large quantities of carbon to storing large quantities of carbon. And to me, this illustrates the role. It was serendipitous to a degree, largely driven by a legal loss on the part of the Forest Service that required this huge policy paradigm shift. But the benefit was forest carbon. And to me, it poses the question nationally, shouldn't the Forest Service be paying careful attention to that trend when they really began to re-examine how they were managing forests and move from the timber era to the ecosystem management era? If we were to do that nationally and even globally, I think this is what the United Nations and others are calling for, is a real reexamination of the way forests are managed, so that we are not only meeting our needs for wood products, but we're also paying attention to the bottom line of carbon change or carbon storage globally.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes sense. So you had mentioned earlier, so Bev, you had mentioned earlier the like rotation age of like 40 years. Like to me, that's like, I know for, like a pulp and paper perspective, that might be great because you can, but yeah, to me, a 40-year, that's not enough time for any kind of full forest cycle to take place, right? So that's not surprising to me that there's a biodiversity issue and that sort of thing. So I'm trying to figure out how much of that is going on? How much of the rotation age is only 40 years and how much of it is longer than that? I'm trying to understand the picture again, kind of looking for more context again. Or maybe, Jim, you want to answer that. I don't know.
Go ahead, Bev.
Yeah, sure. It's been, I think with the average that we've had was about 40 years.
That's the average. Wow.
Yeah. And so when I had, and of course I'm from Florida, and I was there during the multiple use. That's where I got my training in multiple use and intensive forest management. So down there, the rotations are even shorter for poles versus saw timber, but in the Pacific Northwest is known for saw timber. So when I moved to Oregon, though, in the 80s, you could watch 3 logging trucks go by and each one has a different section of a tree on it. And that means they were logging a lot of big trees back in the late 80s and a lot of trucks just passing through our little town. And so over the years that kept getting shorter and shorter intervals. And I think it was economics maybe is the main reason. Accountant says we need a little more now to smooth out the bumps. Who knows? But so it's changed to that. And that's what we're saying is, I remember when it was back over 100. So why can't we get back up there? And again, I'm not saying that all industrial lands have to do that, but we also have issues when you have a patchwork of industrial land next to sort of native forests. Because they impacted the edges of the native forest get impacted by that heat, those big heat events or extreme heat events, because the whole sides of the trees are taking on a heat load. So that happened in an extreme event. So those are things to think about when you're talking about managing and then how it plays out on the landscape.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I was trying to formulate this question in my mind, and I'm not sure if it's going to come out properly, but I kind of wanted to play devil's advocate for a second in regards to, again, the whole forest picture, because you're talking about how so newly disturbed forests are a net carbon source for the first 10 to 20 years, and then they start to accumulate more and more. But throughout that time, if there was an old forest there, it would be accumulating significantly more carbon. And I'm assuming it would take. So if the old forest is 120 years old, it'll take that long to absorb that much carbon again. So it's really putting us into a pretty big net loss as far as carbon storage is concerned, at least on the stand level. But I'm trying to think about what are some of the arguments? I'm trying to think about when you're talking about the whole forest and there are going to be fires, right? That are inevitable and they're coming up more and more and more. How do we start to think about that concept of I'm not making any sense at all. I apologize. But I've been formulating this question in my head for like the last 10, 15 minutes and I couldn't quite get it. I thought maybe if I started talking, I could get it out, but it's not working. But I guess my question is at the whole forest level. We know that disturbances are going to happen, right? And people will make arguments about fire and a certain amount of disturbance. So on a whole forest level, how do we?
Hey Matt, let me guess where I think
Jim,
you might be
pick
going.
it up and try and do something productive with it.
Well, going back to this fundamental question of, how do you manage for these big issues like climate change and hold on to a lot of the carbon that forests are naturally gifted in creating and holding on to, and at the same time provide for some level of economic activity and meeting our needs for natural resources. You might know that I wrote a book called Toward a Natural Forest, a memoir kind of recounting my experiences dealing in fundamentally with this very question. And I think, if you step back and at least if you look at the United States, prior to the incursion of white peoples into this continent, I think you could characterize almost all the forest lands were generally mature and old growth in character, except where there had been some perturbations, like fire or tornadoes or bug epidemics and that kind of thing. But the character of the American woodland was mature and old growth. And I would say my view is that the private industrial model is to convert most of that into capital and then begin to look at managing on short rotation ages and so on for maximum economic potential. But to me, the real challenge of the Forest Service would be to entertain a new model that really looks at restoring this character of mature and old growth forest as the condition. When you go to a national forest, this is what you see, mature and old growth forest that would allow for some selective removals of important economic timber, but clearly one of the drivers would be carbon. And mature and old growth forests are champions at this. And once you attain this, print of mature and old growth conditions over most of the landscape, then you can selectively get some timber removals and harvest to meet your economic needs. But we're a long ways from that.
Yeah,
we had it, we lost it. I think we need to start working back toward it.
Well, it sounds to me like, again, I would adjust what you said a little bit, but I liked how you said old growth characteristics, right? Like that's the kind of the feel or the characteristics of that landscape, not necessarily the vegetation itself. Because talking to a lot of indigenous folks, right, they talk a lot about how much they manage the land, and they did manage it as a mosaic, right? They had everything from obviously young to old growth. And I know you weren't saying everything was old growth. You're saying there was the characteristics of it. And I think it sounds like after Western development, that in the States, you sounds like you have young forests and you have old forests and you have really not much in between, which is not the natural state of the forest and not a healthy state, right? So is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think we've seen a real bifurcation of management goals on private lands. It remains generally short rotation economic forestry, and on national forest lands, they are striving for a much more well-rounded, holistic environmental approach to manage for all resources now, including things like forest carbon, all set against the backdrop of pervasive fire. I'm not suggesting it's easy, but I do think that public lands need to play a very different role in our society than what we see on private industrial lands.
No, absolutely. No, that makes sense. Yeah. And Jim, to follow that thought, like you talked about, I watched that, the documentary, Seeing the Forest with you in there talking about the Siuslaw National Forest. I said that right?
Yeah, on the Oregon coast.
Yeah. And I found it really fascinating because it was talking about that a lot, right? You were talking about, kind of that disconnect, and you were talking at that time, you were the deputy chief at that point, no? Or was that just before?
Well, I was a forest supervisor in charge of the Siuslaw National Forest. I became deputy chief after that.
Okay. And in that documentary, you were talking a lot about the, public disenfranchisement with the way forests are being managed, right? And there was a gentleman in there, I don't remember his name, but he had passed this sentence talking about how it's important for the public license, for there to be public license on the landscape and for people to be on board with it, and that over decades and decades and decades, that public trust in forest management was going away, and only when the Forest Service had fallen. This is the kind of the quote from the documentary, but you had said only when the Forest Service had fallen so far out of public favor, when the disconnect between what the Forest Service was doing and what the public could accept became so vast, that's when the Forest Service realized what was going wrong. And at that point, it was too late, and politicians had to step in. And it almost seems like there's a bit of a relationship here between that situation where management wasn't paying attention to what the public was asking of them, and therefore politicians had to step in, and what's going on federally in the U.S., where all of a sudden now the Biden government is saying, okay, well, it's time for us to step in and fix this and stand up for what the people's values, right?
So let's give credit where credit's due. That statement is attributed to Andy Stahl.
Okay.
He's the president of the Forest Service Employees for Environmental Ethics.
Gotcha.
I'm sure Bev and Alex know of him, and other people would as well. One of my favorite statements is, if you don't take care of your business, somebody else will. Mm-hmm. And I think this was the notion that the Forest Service had lost the ability to take care of their business. They were found to be willfully violating wildlife laws, and a judge stepped in and crushed us, and we had to start over. And I would say this, to me, if you look at a level playing field, for decades, the playing field on national forests had been tipped heavily in front of timber interests at the expense of environmental interests like the Sierra Club. Sure. And so a lot of the environmental groups had chafed for decades at being given the short end of the stick. And so then a judge leveled the playing field and said, it's not big timber anymore. You must pay attention to things like wildlife habitat, water quality, fisheries. And so we did. We set out to change the management regimen on the Siuslaw National Forest from timber production to restoration forestry. And I will say, I mean, for me, it was incredibly gratifying because so many of our former critics applauded us and welcomed this transition and basically said, this is what we've been waiting for. Yeah. A more fair, even-handed, balanced approach to managing public forests.
And I just want to modify one thing Jim said, which was the environmental interests of people writ large. I think there's started to be a general consciousness of folks who enjoyed these places for one reason or another, or had values on the forest that they felt were not being represented. And, in some ways, getting involved and talking to the land managing agencies around what that management should look like is a necessity. It's like voting in some cases. There's an obligation to be engaged in what that land management is looking like on lands that are specifically for the public.
Well, it's that public engagement piece, right? You need that public engagement piece to start to do that kind of value type management. You need to know what values exist on the land and what we want to do. Because if I was to speak, I know I've spoken with some people in the past. I can't remember who I can quote this to, but they had said once that the forest industry has done what the public had asked of them for a long time, right? And now the public is asking something else, and which is like totally reasonable, right? And now it's time to start to address those changes and to flow with them and not stick to the old fight and do the old thing, right? It's time to evolve. It's time to change. And that's something that came up in that documentary as well with Jim, the Seeing the Forest thing, right? He said the Forest Service was given a choice, right? You can fight the old fight till the end and just stand your ground. You can give up and go home, or you can find a new way. And I like that finding a new way thing. It means we can go forward together. And furthered in that documentary was the collaborative approach of all that, right? Where you brought in that public engagement piece. You brought in all of the stakeholders to the same table, from industry to government to environmental groups to public recreation groups, and everyone was there. And they figured a way forward together where everyone could succeed. And I see that as the epitome, right? That's the way forward. That's the new way. And it was exciting to see that. Very, very cool. So in a way, President Biden has just kind of stepped in as a judge and said, "I'm ruling that we need a new paradigm." And so this recent executive order last Friday that he announced in Seattle, he put forest carbon squarely on the table, and he acknowledged that
mature and old growth forests are the place where we do best with forest carbon.
Yeah.
And he was signaling that we need a new federal policy that accentuates and focuses on mature and old growth forests to address this issue.
Yeah.
For me, as a former Forest Service official, I'm terribly excited about the next few months. I think they're going to be very dramatic in terms of, the battles between the old guard and the new guard, and seeing how this battle is played out and who actually wins. I think the outcome is very uncertain.
Interesting. Very interesting. So what do you guys hope to, maybe Alex, maybe you want to speak to this. What is being proposed? Like where do you guys see this going? Let's put it this way. What do you hope is the outcome of this new initiative?
I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is thinking about what Jim was getting at before, which is these moments where there's been a shift in what it looks like for land management. And I think the buildup of the discussion we've had so far is really about how do you start to account for the values of carbon in public lands generally, like the administration's been doing for 30 by 30. And now more specifically, what does it look like to create executive action that would start to direct mapping, cataloging, and conserving, I think to paraphrase the president, the mature and old growth forests on federally managed lands across the country. So I think that to what Jim had just said, it's on the table. And I think that that's a really big first step. And so now, to my mind, one of the critical pieces of that is making sure that it continues rolling forward, and that it continues rolling forward in a timeline that's going to work. We know that forests can be a missing piece of the climate change, the things that we can do to be combating climate change, but there's only so many years, decades left that we can be influencing that. And so I think that puts an even higher premium on these mature and old growth trees that we're looking at conserving.
No, that totally makes sense. Yeah, we're in it. It's a very unique and challenging situation to try to manage and suss your way through it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And, Matt, you brought up before the reforestation, and I think it came up a little bit in the discussion around the IPCC reports. And the proforestation piece of that just can't get lost in the mix. Just knowing that the powerhouses of carbon storage and sequestration are existing and standing and doing their jobs, keeping those in the ground is step one.
Right. Yeah. To make sure that we have what we have right now, and we're not going more into deficit and then try to jump that up. So I did see, I think the Biden government also said they were going to start planting a few billion trees, similar to what Canada's up to with our 2 billion tree initiative, to try and, I guess that's for future stuff. Is that true? Did I read that right? Do you guys know about that? No?
I think I saw something about that. I know that the Forest Service has struggled with what we call a backlog of reforestation needs that's decades in the making, and I think this was hopefully an investment to catch up. By doing more in the way of nurseries. Where they actually create the planting stock. And then the investment of hiring people to actually get them in the ground.
Yeah.
But it's in a way, it's really an effort to make up for what has been a historic backlog.
Yeah, I think it was like 1.3 billion trees in the next 10 years or something. It was supposed to be afforestation, I think, similar to the Canadian plan. I know we're trying to do 2 billion trees by 2030 with the intention of that being an investment in our future carbon storage capacity, right?
Sure.
So, yeah.
Well, so just bear in mind the information that Bev Law was giving us about it's a good thing. You hate to see forested lands barren, but you just have to remember from a carbon standpoint that those young seedlings are very puny in terms of their capacity to create carbon stores as compared to what Alex was talking about, the giants that you already have. So much more effective to hold on to what you have.
That's why I use the word investment, as it'll pay dividends in the future. Yeah, and not currently exactly at this moment in point in time. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Ben.
That's why, I named, and maybe a couple of us came up with this on our own, but named it strategic forest reserves. It was when I was reading about the strategic petroleum reserves and I thought, the light went on. Oh, well, that's what we need for forests. It's what we need for climate change. There could be strategic marine reserves. All of these things that we're trying to do to deal with climate mitigation by storing carbon and climate adaptation by protecting ecosystems and the life within them.
Absolutely. And it's funny how it's so difficult to, because people have these values on the landscape that are hard to quantify in a capitalist society, right? And that's ultimately where we're struggling here. We're trying to put a dollar value on beauty and carbon capture and biodiversity, and it's hard to do, right? Yeah. So it's funny that's always the point that we're getting to. I would love to see something, I don't know. I guess that's what a carbon tax is, right? I guess that's what that is putting a dollar value on it.
And there are other things that can be done with, a lot of what I've heard from interviews and people talking with people who have ownerships in the Coast Range. They're not all about cutting timber. They really want to protect their forests and the wildlife in them. And so it's trying to find incentives, conservation easements, tax deferrals, things that you can help them with, because really it's paying the taxes on the land every year that's the hardest thing for them to do.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. So ultimately, if we're talking, something that I think we should define is I should have done this at the beginning. I didn't. Mature and old growth. So in the sense of maintaining this mature and old growth, Bev, I'll let you take this one because you were talking. You have this knowledge in your brain right now, I'm sure, about exactly at what point it can be considered mature from a carbon capture standpoint and old growth.
Well, we do it from an analysis standpoint, and we've put the plots, of how much carbon is in each of the plots and plotted against age. So it's the carbon stocks versus age, and you see where it starts to slow down in the rate of increase. So it's beyond 20 years is mature, but it depends on some species in some areas that get there faster. And some are sprinters and some are in it for the long haul. And Douglas fir is, it just keeps increasing. It's really surprising to see it, but it just keeps the stocks keep increasing and increasing at a good, healthy rate. So, those are, when you look at what's old is that complex structure. It has a few old trees. They're not always all old. Some places they might be because somebody managed it. Or some of the systems are just that way that they all grow up together. But in general, old growth has a complex structure to it. And then one of the things that we did was we looked at 600,000 trees in the inventory data for the east side of Oregon, east of the Cascade Crest. And the largest 3% of trees in that whole area, 6 national forests, held 43 or 42% of the ecosystem carbon.
Oh.
So there are a lot of areas where you have just a few big trees. Now, we're not calling trees a forest, but some places are like that now. And so you really want to be able to protect those because of how much they already hold in them and they've been holding for hundreds of years.
So I'm thinking about this, again, I'm Canadian, I work in the boreal forest, that's my context. So I'm thinking about this from kind of a boreal perspective of where our natural disturbance regime is fire, right? Fire is the big one here. And I think, I don't know the exact number, but I'll put one out there that I think I can paraphrase was, fire returns to the boreal forest every 80 to 120 years on average, right? So I know we figured if we harvest at that rate, that's kind of following that trend. But I wanted to put that on you. How do we start to talk about carbon in that context of something where that the natural regime is that it's going to burn in 100 years?
Well, there's a huge standard deviation around that.
Absolutely.
So,
Of course there is. That's why I said average.
Yeah, and some of the things that happen, like in the lodgepole pine in the Colorado area, is that they all became very close in age, so that you had problems building, and it was better as a more mosaic, perhaps, and that might be how those systems evolved as mosaics. And then when you also have a mosaic with fire, and like we have the mixed severity fire regime, it's low, medium, and high severity. It's much easier for those systems to regenerate on their own because it's so patchy. So, and I just mean, there are areas that are along all these edges. The more edge that you had after a fire, you have a lot of seed that falls in. There's seed that some of them are evolved to seed after fire, like lodgepole pine. So you treat some of the systems differently like that, but and I'm talking about more of a landscape kind of perspective, but I think people do have to get their noses away from my forest and think about it at different scales. And then again, how much it matters to have high carbon density. I remember some people had mentioned, well, what about the dry systems? Well, there are areas within those dry regions that are like refugia, and they don't necessarily need to be cut or reduced biomass. So there, you do have to really think at different levels. And then I also always say, as a carpenter, measure twice, cut once. Really think about what's needed in a specific area.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. Go. Yep.
Hey, Matt, I know that this might be too simplistic, but thinking about your previous discussion about mature and old growth, there's, that you can watch. Well, let's take a human, for instance. We have a life expectancy of 75 or 80, but a lot of times we're viewed as reaching maturity about 20. That's where our body size kind of reaches its maximum, and then we age without really growing much, and we slip into, aging and dying, and we kind of fall apart slowly, like I'm doing now. But the forests, like the Douglas fir forests, live to be hundreds and hundreds of years old. And yet I think what they call the accumulation of mean annual increment, where a tree starts growing rapidly and then it begins to plateau. And so the growth begins to table.
Yes.
And that a lot of times that occurs around 75 or 80 years, even at a relatively young age.
Yep.
That tree becomes mature.
Yes.
And it's a completely different thing from carbon. I think that Bev is pointing out that these trees continue to grow over time in their capacity to store carbon. So, how fast the tree is growing and how much carbon it sequesters are really two different questions.
That's a great point. A great point.
Yes. But the issue is that I think a lot of trees reach maturity at a relatively young age in terms of just when people think about it. That happens pretty fast. And so I think all across the United States, something like 80 years is probably a pretty good rule of thumb. Sure. In terms of when many species reach maturity as a tree.
Well, that opens up a good opportunity. And thank you, Jim. That was a perfect way of bringing this together. And that opens up a great opportunity for Bev. I wanted to ask you about that, because I think that's kind of some of the discussion going on with industry, right? Is that, by harvesting more, we're capturing that carbon and holding it for longer than it would in the fire where it would be released, right? And I know from the stuff that I've read regarding your research that that's not necessarily the case. So I want to give you the opportunity to maybe talk about that. Can you explain the difference between harvesting and fire in a carbon perspective?
Yeah. So if whatever you remove, we track that, and this is going on at the international level. We've been doing it for 20 years, and in tracking carbon from once you've harvested it, where does all that carbon go? Some's left on the ground, and some is used in mills for their energy, and some is used for short-term products, and I would say most of it. And then when you get, it depends on areas. Like Sweden is different from us, and some industries claim they have more going into saw timber than others. But there are numbers on that, and there are data available on that. And so what we've found is that, like over 100 years of harvesting, that's equivalent to all the Coast Range forests, for Oregon, over 100 years, about 60% of that carbon's back in the atmosphere that was harvested is back in the atmosphere. And 19% is in landfills, and right around 16 to 18% is in the long-term products. Well, even when we did studies on removals in ponderosa pine to protect them from fire, 60% of that carbon was back in the atmosphere in 30 years. So, in other words, when there's harvesting, you're kind of starting the clock for all the decomposition and combustion that happens after that. Whereas when the Forest Service did a study, and Jim's probably familiar with this, on their treatments to reduce fire risk or fire severity, only about 1% of the areas treated actually experienced fire. So it's hard to guess exactly when and where to do that. And so when you've done all that harvesting, you've put it into this atmospheric conveyor of carbon.
Sure.
That reminds me of a roulette wheel. When you bet on one particular number, what are the odds that ball is going to land on your number? And I think that's what Bev was bringing up is. You can do a lot of these land treatments, but you're basically betting that fire is going to visit that landscape that you just managed to reduce fire risk. It's a very low probability.
Yeah.
Which calls into question the wisdom of the investment.
Interesting. So tying that into like what Jim had said about the mean annual increment, so where the growth starts to slow down in a tree, versus the mean annual increment of carbon. I don't know if that's a good comparison, but you know what I mean. How would you start to compare those two? So like if a forest management company understands the mean annual increment, but if the mean annual increment of carbon storage is further down the line, maybe that's a different incentive, a different way of thinking about it. How much do you think that differs, Bev?
Well,
I don't know if that's a reasonable thing to ask you, but
yeah, you just say mathematically half is carbon.
Sure.
So in that case, it would be equal. But if you're trying to, decide, I'm always thinking more on federal lands about what they're doing, because that's something that we all have a stake in. And in federal lands, I would go to, you got to protect biodiversity, man. You got to protect the species. We're having extinctions going on. We need to protect our water sources, our drinking water sources. So those two are big things, and carbon is along with that. That's for the climate mitigation. So you would, I love Jim's idea of just letting the forest grow on national forests, and the federal forests in general, because they can reach that potential. You don't have to, they as the forests get older, they have canopy gaps that might form, and then younger trees come in and they develop that older structure.
Sure.
So there are things that can happen like that, but if you can do that on federal lands, that's where we have the most power, most ability to combat climate change.
And, I think along those lines, we're talking about the question of designating maturity. If you look at Northwest Forest Plan, which was one of the last large ecosystem level plans on the west slope of the Cascades, ranging from border of Canada on down into Northern California, covering multiple national forests and millions of acres, that we can look at that now, past in 1994, we're more than 25 years out, and look at the benefits that has provided us. And it's carbon, it's clean drinking water for communities, it's biodiversity. But that maturity age was, you could probably make the argument that around the late successional reserves that were designated around 80 years is probably the corollary for that. Yeah. And we could see, that the benefits of that stand today. And in a lot of ways, I think show through in ways that we couldn't have imagined in 1994.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was quite an experiment of opportunity because it happened. And, we were one of the ones, I guess, who went in there and did the analysis. And over 17 years after it got harvest on public lands was reduced by about 86%. The carbon accumulation kept going up on those forests over that 17 years and was 8 times higher than that of private lands. Some of their harvest was reduced too, but they were still hovering around carbon neutral, meaning they hadn't gained much. They just kept gaining a little and losing a little over that time frame.
Yeah. I was just thinking about this concept of letting the forest grow and that sort of thing. And in the era of climate change, where we know fires are so prevalent and they're only getting bigger and getting worse and all this sort of thing, how do we make sense of the fire piece in here?
Okay, so right? With fire, again, it's just one size does not fit all. There might be dry areas where you have, and I've worked so extensively in ponderosa pine and juniper over on the east side. So you might have fuel ladders that are young trees that are under the canopies of the big trees. And there are people who are being very careful about just removing those so that they still maintain some canopy structure. But it keeps the fuel ladders out. Or they'll do underburning of the shrubs if they've gotten too high and flame length could reach up onto the crown. But, those big trees, right, the crown's way up there. So, and they have super thick bark. And they're good at dealing with this. So, right. So yeah, with wildfire, you might end up treating some of those areas, and they have been doing that, and pretty broad scale, but I don't think it needs to be to the extent that people are going in some of it and some of the things that are happening. And then you can, the fire returning, although in the older forest, the Douglas fir, that's, 100 to several hundred years. So, in watching that, those forests are still doing fine. When we look at our maps and the vulnerability, it's just not there in those wet coastal rainforests. It's no, in a relative sense, not vulnerable compared to so many other forests in the dry systems. So that's kind of where the management could go, is when you're thinking, what can they do? But really the most important thing I see is that people start fires. A lot of the fires are started by us. Totally. Operating machinery at the wrong time of the year in forests. I even saw this when I was up in Glacier National Park. We saw a fire start, and it was near a little community of just a couple houses. And then it took that whole side while we were there, mountainside. So we have to learn to be much more careful about not starting them when it's really high fire risk, a high chance. The weather is windy and dry, and it's been dry for a long time. So the other is that we've got to protect communities, and I would say start from the inside out. So we need to make sure that, and we're doing this, I'm telling everybody in these areas that, you can do your part by changing the materials on the exterior of your house and changing the venting. The guy in Canada, Cohen, had done some nice experiments and showed how the flames were getting into the houses through the vents, under the eaves. So there are things like that can be done to help communities harden their homes. And then make sure that they just don't operate machinery during those time frames. Likewise with the Forest Service, we have a research natural area, and there are a lot of ATVs that go in there in summer. Well, they might need to bite the bullet and just close the gates when it's that severe, when it's that risky.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. We've had some quad ATV, some ATV closures in the province last year. I think was it last year? Maybe a couple years ago. But yeah, they stopped. You weren't allowed to drive an ATV in the bush for it was 2 or 3 weeks. It was going to be a fine, right? And yeah, it was necessary because we had those wildfires just coming in only because of starting a fire from the heat of a muffler of an ATV or something like that. So no, totally. Absolutely. Yeah. I'm all for that. If that's what it takes to protect the forest, then why not? Right.
Hey, Matt, if you look historically, there's some interesting things that generally out of all the fire ignitions that start, about 98% of them are controlled at very small sizes, but about 2% of the fire ignitions are the ones that do all the great damage.
Yeah.
And that's been true for a long time. And we see now that in spite of how many people are employed and the amount of money that the Forest Service spends on budgeting for fire and fire suppression, the acres burned have been climbing, and the damage done has been climbing. I also heard an interesting statistic that about 40% of the acres burned today are generally the result of backfires that are set by firefighting personnel to try to control the bigger fire from getting bigger.
That go awry.
So there is that, but Bev mentioned the home ignition zone. Is that what we're really seeing? The most painful aspect of what we're dealing with fires right now is the loss of homes and the loss of life. And what was the term you used, Bev? Was building fire suppression from the inside out.
Yeah.
That the great opportunity is really investing in our communities to try and protect them from the fire risk. And I've wondered, the Forest Service is going to be throwing billions of dollars at this fire issue. And I've wondered, what are they going to accomplish in 10 years trying to manage the tree aspect of fires? What would be happening if they spent that money for the next 10 years on managing the structure landscape, helping communities get ready for fire preparedness and all that kind of thing? To me, it's just, I just feel like we're ready for a completely different look at how we manage this whole complex of fire, communities in forested environments, and that type of thing. It's just screaming for a completely different approach.
Yeah. Yeah. Alex, you wanted to say something there?
Yeah.
Or did Jim steal your thunder?
He said it very eloquently. I think that that's your opportunity for investment right there. Working from the community out, working on home hardening pieces and ensuring that folks are safe. I think we're already seeing the worsening impacts and climate change making these fires far more concerning. And so the urgency is there.
Absolutely. And I would be remiss. I know I would catch hell from Amy Christensen if I didn't mention the need for more good fire as well, right? A need for more prescribed fire, more cultural burning, more of that. Just try and stop this as well. I know Amy would be pissed at me if I didn't at least bring it up once.
Well, I wanted to mention too, while we're talking about this, generally, Matt, when you see all these statistics, like 1 million acres burned, it's worth noting that they don't all burn the same. That there's also kind of a rule of thumb that generally out of that 1 million acres burned, probably 15 to 20% is burned modestly or lightly, much as a lot of the indigenous peoples would burn their native homelands recurrently. And then you probably have another, 40 to 45% that's burned at a moderate intensity that actually recovers quite rapidly from the fire. And then you have a component of severe burns, where there can be some real damage done. But the point that Bev brought up about we're not losing the carbon. When these forests burn, we're not losing the carbon. Most of what you see in the air is water vapor. And what did you say, Bev? Sometimes that only 2 to 3% of the carbon is lost into the atmosphere. The vast majority stays in place in the wood, and will remain so for hundreds of years. And then the forest recovers and it starts sequestering carbon again.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because that's kind of the misnomer, right? I think people assume that the fire is the worst thing for carbon sourcing.
I have a theory for that.
Bev, you're saying, go ahead. Okay. What is it?
It's what appears in the press. You have a natural tendency to maybe show the worst of it. and that's all that people see. And Jim is right. We did an analysis over a lot of the Western U.S., and it was really a large portion of it is just these light litter, that just goes over the surface fires, and that's really what you want to see. And then there's maybe a moderate amount, and then the lower percentage in the mixed severity regime that we're still in is it ranges between 10 and 20%. The California ones, where he'd used a lot of our coefficients. We went out and measured this stuff for big trees of the Northwest in our kind of forests, and they determined some of those California fires that only about 1.5 to 2% of the tree, above ground tree mass burned. So it combusted. And so, not only that, they still have cones there that are functional. So, leave them there so that they can have some natural regeneration.
Interesting. Because, I think the thought for most people was that, fire comes through, it burns up all the small matter, all the branches, all that. That's immediate carbon into the atmosphere. And then the log falls over, slowly decays, and releases all of that carbon. Mm-hmm. And the thought is that all of the carbon from the tree, not including the root system and the carbon, which is like mostly stored in the soil, not including the soil carbon, but all of the vegetation carbon is released because of a fire. But it sounds like from your research, that's not exactly what's going on, which is really, really, that changes the way we think about things for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very interesting. So I guess I was trying to figure out how to end this, because I don't, we've covered a lot of ground. And usually I have like a nice fancy way of like tying things in a little bit of a knot and being like, so these are the takeaways from this. But it seems like the takeaways are kind of that we need more mature and old growth forests on the land for now to continue, or not just for now, we need them on the land to continue to sequester carbon as time goes on, and try and play catch up with the rest of the forest, and try to understand how we can get back to a place where it is more sustainable from an all-inclusive value perspective. And in the meantime, fireproof your homes and fireproof the nearby communities and that kind of thing. And just, hope we can reduce that risk. It's a weird one to try and tie together, but it's a lot.
Well, I would say, I think you touched on some good points there, Matt. I think the key thing that I think what President Biden was saying is we need to figure out a way to hold on to the mature and old growth forests that we have and grow more. Secondly, as it relates to the whole forest fire issue and how that conflates with forest management, that kind of thing, is the best investments are probably in community hardening, trying to invest directly in communities and work from the inside out, rather than trying to protect all the hundreds of millions of acres, surrounding the communities. And then I think, to the convergence of values, when you work with forest carbon and old growth forests, all the things that come with it, more pure water, better wildlife habitat, better scenery, more biodiversity. These, I think, are the long-term values that serve the American public best in the long run.
Absolutely. No, I agree. That makes sense. Thanks, Jim. I appreciate someone taking the reins on this and making sense of it all, because I have been struggling today. Well, I'll blame it on it being the American context, and I have no understanding.
That's Bev Law's fault. She will take your mind and work it like an egg beater. If some of her she confounds common sense.
Yeah. That's hilarious. Oh, well, I don't know. Does anybody have anything they want to finish with? They think they want to, maybe a final thought, maybe something that came up during the conversation that they want to share before we call it a wrap?
I guess
it's okay if you don't.
There's just one that I thought was really made us thrilled, was IPCC report that came out, and working group 1 and 2. 1 is physical science spaces. 2 covered the impacts, and then there's mitigation and adaptation. But they finally recognized that we need the biodiversity of animals, of genetic diversity, it's all intertwined. Biodiversity and climate change is intertwined. And if you do anything to address one, you need to think about the other at the same time and deal with them simultaneously. And they even stated in the reports, it's a fairly conservative report. It's written for policymakers. They all have to agree on it, but they all agreed that maintaining the resilience of biodiversity and ecosystem services depends on effective conservation of about 30 to 50% of Earth's land, freshwater, and ocean areas, including currently near natural ecosystems. So we're thinking, okay, now they've got it. You can't just treat one thing separately. This was really good news.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. I think that's something we've been struggling with in Alberta too, where we're starting to realize that we can't manage everything individually, right? We need that collaborative, all-inclusive, big picture approach if we want to succeed, because otherwise we're just going to be running into each other and creating more problems than we can possibly solve in a day. So I think we're all kind of coming to this realization at the same time when it comes to land management, which is interesting. It's taken us so long, but I'm glad it's happening.
Yeah, it's an opportunity.
Before I give Alex the last word, because I think he deserves it. This was kind of his idea to get this conversation together.
I didn't really give you much to talk about, did I? Sorry about that.
Well, hold on a second. I worked for over 35 years with the Forest Service. I retired 20 years ago, and I've been a little dismayed about how the Forest Service has been asleep at the wheel on this forest carbon issue. And I guess I would just say it's time to wake up and smell the carbon.
That's a good one.
That's a good one. I like it. Excellent. Nice quip. How long did it take you to write that one, Jim?
I just thought of it about a minute ago.
Hey, you're quick. You're quick. I'm not that quick.
Well, I'll paraphrase Jim paraphrasing Gifford Pinchot, but I think, back to that quote of working for the greatest good, for the greatest number in the longest run, and thinking about how that looks for Forest Service management. If we are looking multiple generations ahead and thinking about what do you do now to ensure that for the long haul, that carbon is really the answer to that piece. And so I think back to what you'd said, Matt, there's an opportunity for collaboration and pushing something forward here. So stay tuned. Exciting times.
Absolutely. And I think I don't mean to steal your thunder as the last word, but I just wanted to add to what you were saying. I think it's important that everybody comes to the table with an open mind, and everybody comes to the table, because I think, well, especially for industry, right? There's a tendency to come here feeling blamed and have the finger pointed at them, right? And I think if we're going to succeed here, everyone needs to come together and with an open mind and try to collaborate in a real way, like they did in I'm going to screw it up again, the Siuslaw National Forest, right? Siuslaw, sorry about that. Siuslaw. Yes, okay, perfect. Now I know. Now you tell me. Why did you say that before we started recording? But yeah, I think it's all about the headspace, right? The headspace of folks coming into this, and we have to go into it and kind of maybe put the past in the past and go, okay, this is a new leaf. How do we do this now? This is the situation we're in. How can we manage this the best way for all values, period, right? And I think it's an exciting opportunity. And I think now is the first time in human history where we've been able to maybe pull that off, right? With the onset of the internet and communication as much as it is, right? So, that's a conversation we're having in Canada as well. So with that, thank you, everybody. Thank you. Yeah, this was really, really great. I'm glad I was able to stick handle it from some kind of way. I kind of made a mess of it a little bit in the middle, but I appreciate your patience, and I appreciate, Jim, you especially coming to my rescue a couple times there. That was great. It's very important to have, again, we're collaborative effort here, right? We're trying to do this together. So, I want to say thank you to all three of you, and very especially to Alex and to Maithani for organizing this from the Sierra Club. This was all you guys. This is your brain baby here at this point. Thank you very much for providing these contacts through Jim and Bev and yourself. And I look forward to keeping in contact and seeing where things go. And there's always opportunity to talk again. I'm here. Thanks everyone for listening. I know that made my head spin. There's a lot going on there, but I definitely learned a bunch, and I really, really appreciate everybody that was a part of this. Thank you to if you were involved. Thank you so much. And I hope you guys enjoyed that. It was great for me. So, yeah, more of that coming on. Lots more conversations to be had. I release an episode every 3 weeks, and if you can get out there and maybe, if you want to help out, the best thing you can do is rate and review and share it. So it turns out Spotify don't really have any reviews, weirdly, so throw a bunch in there. I got lots on Apple, but not a lot on Spotify. So if you're on Spotify, please just go and hit the 5-star button, maybe say this podcast dope or whatever you want to say. I don't know if you talk like that, but yeah, anything's appreciated. And yeah, just share it on social media, that kind of thing. I'd really appreciate it. It really helps me out. And yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in a few weeks. Take care.